Welcome, everybody. For Grand Rounds today, I am going to introduce Isaac Rue, who is an epidemiologist and research assistant professor in the UW Department of Psychiatry and an adjunct research assistant professor in the Department of Epidemiology, where he completed his graduate training. His research interests are in the etiology and prevention and co-occurrence of substance misuse and common mental health problems. He is particularly interested in the role of the neighborhood, social, and built environment in the development of these problems. His research, which you'll hear about today, includes a secondary analysis project that he led examining neighborhood factors and alcohol misuse in adult twins, and work as a co-investigator on a longitudinal study of neighborhood influences on substance use and other health problems in a cohort followed from childhood into the late 30s. Dr. Rue is also interested in the application of novel epidemiologic and statistical methods and serves as co-investigator and applied statistician on multiple longitudinal observational studies and RCTs. He is based at the Center for the Study of Health and Risk Behaviors, where he directs the Data Analysis and Methods Core. Dr. Rue.
Thanks. Well, thanks, Sharon. Thanks to the Grand Rounds Organizing Planning Committee for allowing me to speak to you all today. So today I'm going to be talking to you about the role of geospatial context and the aspects of place and how they influence alcohol use, misuse, and substance use in general, but primarily around the role of alcohol, or around alcohol use and misuse. So I'll be talking about some of the theories and mechanisms underlying the role of neighborhood context on alcohol use and misuse. I'm going to be talking about some of the key findings on specific neighborhood characteristics and some of the existing literature around there. I'm going to be talking about some of my own research on neighborhoods and alcohol. And then, as Sharon mentioned, I have some particular interest in methodology and epidemiologic methods. So I'll probably be talking a little bit about methods and some of the challenges in conducting this research, but I'll try not to get too bogged down in regards to this. Then I'm also going to be talking about some of the future directions that I see in this research, particularly moving past just the neighborhood residential context. Okay, just to prime the pump a little bit and help us start to think about the role of environmental context on health and health behaviors, we're actually going to start talking about fish. So this picture here is showing the Haplochromis bertoni. This is a cichlid fish that's native to East Africa. What's really fascinating to me about this fish is that it shows a very strong social hierarchy. And particularly it's interesting in how it displays this hierarchy in regards to not only its behaviors, but also its appearance and its biology. So in this species of fish, in the males, there are two types of social status. There's the territorial fish, and there's a non-territorial fish. And in the lab, we are totally not PC, and so we referred to them as machos and wimps. So the territorial fish, they showed very strong territorial behaviors, so they would claim a territory, and then if any other fish were to get nearby, it would chase them away very aggressively. In terms of their appearance, they're very brightly colored. They tend to be a little bit larger. They have these spots on their fins, and they have this bar just underneath their eye. And then in regards to some of the physiological characteristics of this fish, they have higher levels of gonadotropin releasing hormone, or GnRH, and this allows them the ability to produce sperm, and they have larger gonad size. The non-territorial fish, in contrast, tend to be smaller, so they're being chased around all day, and they're really stressed out. They don't have that bright coloration. They have very low levels of GnRH. So what's interesting in some of the experiments that we would do in this lab is that if we were to change the environments of this fish, we could actually change their social status pretty quickly. So in this diagram here, the purple fish are the territorial males, the white fish are non-territorial males, and the yellow fish are females. Those flower pots are the territories that the fish could claim. So for example, if we were to take one of these non-territorial fish and then move them to a tank where there were no other territorial fish, then pretty quickly we would see this fish develop that coloration, that dark eye bar. We would see spikes in GnRH, et cetera. So that all happens within a matter of minutes. On contrast, we could take that territorial fish, move it over to a tank with a bunch of other larger territorial fish and few territories, and that territorial fish would lose its coloration quickly, and it would become a non-territorial fish and exhibit those behaviors, again, within a few minutes. So, and there are a few other things we could do. We could actually add flower pots to the tank or take flower pots out of the tank. That could also change the social hierarchy there. So, again, that was just a way to help us start thinking about the role of social context, the role of environmental context. And so now we're going to start thinking, moving beyond fish tanks and start thinking about neighborhoods and how they might influence human behaviors. The idea that the aspects of our place might influence our health and well-being is not a new one by any means. For example, Ferris and Dunham back in the 1940s, they conducted a study and they looked at psychiatric hospitalization rates across neighborhoods in Chicago. And so that's mapped on this diagram right here. So those darker regions are areas where psychiatric hospitalization rates were the highest. So what they observed was that those particular neighborhoods, one, they're in the urban core of Chicago, and that those neighborhoods tended to be characterized by greater disorganization, so higher levels of poverty, more deterioration in general, and then higher levels of transience. So what they speculated is that there was something about those neighborhood contexts that actually give rise to mental illness. So it's some really neighborhood contextual effect. And so the work of Ferris and Dunham has been very influential to this day and has informed a number of theories around the role of context in health. So since Ferris and Dunham, there has been increasing articulation and awareness of socio-ecological perspectives on health and health behaviors and how they develop. So the general idea is that individuals are embedded in environmental contexts across multiple levels of influence. So we consider some more immediate environments like the family environment, and then more community level environments like neighborhoods, and then more societal contexts as well. So despite some of these theories, the vast majority of work on health behaviors and alcohol use has really focused in on the individual level. And I think that makes sense. Most of my time is spent thinking about individual level risk factors as well. What has been lost, or I think has been the biggest missing level in some of this research in considering the socio-ecological perspective, is really the community or the neighborhood level. That said, I think over the past 20 years, there has started to be somewhat of a shift. So since the 1990s, there has been this increase in the number of publications, at least published around neighborhood effects in health. And so this diagram is just showing that. So you can see pretty steady increases from the early 1990s. And so lots of publications, particularly in public health journals around this topic. So to me, what's particularly exciting about this and this increasing focus on neighborhoods and their potential effects on health is how they might inform new novel intervention strategies. So now we might be able to start thinking a little bit more upstream, thinking about modifiable targets at the neighborhood level. And just as an indicator of how this interest is increasing just more in the consciousness of the medical community more broadly, the Healthy People 2020 initiative has a social determinants of health goal, where the aim is really to create social and physical environments that promote good health for all. So key areas within this are the neighborhood and built environments, and improving those environments, as well as considering the social and community context. So obviously a key indicator and a key aspect of health is substance use and alcohol use. So we all know that alcohol use, or particularly heavy alcohol use, excessive alcohol use, remains a major public health problem in the United States. So according to the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, over half of the population, I think about 60%, are current alcohol drinkers. And about 12% of those current drinkers engage in heavy alcohol use. And so this survey defined that as those who binge drink at least 5 times per month. So a significant proportion of the population who are engaging in heavy hazardous levels of alcohol use. And so we all know that excessive alcohol use, heavy alcohol use, that's associated with a number of functional problems as well as physical and mental health problems for the individuals, and also have quite serious impacts and detriments to their families and extended relationships as well. And we also know that this causes a great burden to society in terms of economics, Some estimates put it at $250 billion per year that's associated with alcohol use. And alcohol use is the third leading preventable cause of death in the United States population. And though it's somewhat complicated, there is some research to suggest that there is a socioeconomic gradient to alcohol use as well, and socioeconomic and racial disparities, but particularly around more hazardous forms of alcohol use and alcohol-related consequences, more disordered use. Okay, so how is it then that the neighborhood context in the neighborhoods where we live could get under our skin, so to speak, and actually influence our alcohol use behaviors? So there are two primary aspects in the neighborhoods that we tend to think about. One is the social environment of the neighborhood, as well as the physical and built environmental aspects of the neighborhood. So within the social environments in the neighborhood, we often think about the social disorganization theory as a guiding framework. So it's pretty much an oversimplification, but this is the idea that neighborhoods with greater socioeconomic disadvantage, they tend to have fewer material resources, and this disrupts the ability to maintain healthy social bonds within the neighborhood. And this could lead to things like lower levels of social capital within the neighborhood. And social capital is a term that's thrown around a lot in a lot of different ways, but typically it's considered like this idea of the features of the neighborhood that facilitate coordinating action on behalf or for the benefit of the neighborhood as a whole. And Sampson and Raudebush, two prominent sociologists, they would say there's two aspects to this. One is social cohesion, so the idea of like the sense of community, sense of bondedness, belongingness in the community, reciprocity, and then informal social control, which I like to think of as if something bad were to occur in the neighborhood, would neighbors there actually do something and step up and do something about it? So on the flip side of social capital is often social disorganization. And so socially disorganized neighborhoods, it's kind of one of those things like, it when you see it, right? So in research, it's typically characterized by the presence of litter, graffiti, abandoned buildings, deterioration, etc. So you can imagine then that living in a disorganized, disadvantaged neighborhood could be particularly stressful. And also these disorganized, disadvantaged neighborhoods, they might have fewer resources for psychosocial support. So taking these things together, it's possible that this could influence alcohol use behaviors that could cause individuals to turn to alcohol in order to cope with their psychological distress or stress in the absence of social support. Further, in low social capital and social disorganization, it might disrupt the norms around substance use or alcohol use as well. In these disorganized neighborhoods, the norms might be a little bit more permissible. And I'm looking at Mary Larimer here. I know a lot of the work that she has done has focused on injunctive norms, and it's found in college students that those injunctive norms, the perceived acceptability of alcohol use, they really matter, particularly for college students. I think they can matter here in terms of the neighborhood level and affecting alcohol use behaviors too. Okay, so in terms of some of the results that we're actually seeing, so a lot of different aspects of the neighborhood social environment have been studied, but by far the most commonly studied neighborhood characteristic is some indicator of the neighborhood socioeconomic status, and usually that's characterized using census data. And so one of the reasons why neighborhood studies have focused on SES is because the census data is actually very easily accessible. You could go online right now and be able to download some census data on neighborhood and disadvantage or neighborhood socioeconomic indicators. So let me just take a quick step briefly to tell you a little bit about how we actually do this neighborhood research. So one of the first things we do is we need to identify a study sample. So investigators typically use some existing study that shows good geographic distribution of participants across whatever geography that they're interested in. And then also have those measures of alcohol use, say that we're also interested in. So first thing we need to do is we need to geocode them. So essentially that means we place their addresses and we put them on the map. We get their spatial coordinates. And that's what I've done. I've hastily put a map together and I used a Seattle-based study and geocoded the location of the participant addresses, and those are shown in orange. Just a quick aside, I think one of the ways I got interested in this research is because playing with maps is so fun. So we've done this, we've put them on a map, and then we can actually link participants to their administrator or their neighborhood boundaries, right? So most commonly we think about neighborhoods, or we define neighborhoods like as census tracts or census block groups. So census tracts, they're based on population size. So they roughly consist of around 4,000 people. Census block groups are a little bit smaller, like around 1,000 people. So once we have this data, or once we link them to this administrative boundary, then we can link the participants to neighborhood level data, like the percent living in poverty, the median household income, et cetera. Okay, so that's a little bit of how we do this. And then obviously then we can start to run some models looking at the associations between the neighborhood factors and alcohol use. And then we can also adjust for individual level covariates, which is going to be very important because we know that, you know, people don't end up in neighborhoods by some random chance, but there are a lot of individual factors that can drive that. So I would say in general, there is some support for aspects of social disorganizations theory. We've seen results and evidence from longitudinal studies as well as cross-sectional studies showing associations with alcohol use, particularly heavier forms of alcohol use or risky forms of alcohol use. And this is even after adjusting for individual level covariates. What's interesting to me is where we don't see associations with is when we categorize alcohol use as any versus none. In fact, there are some studies suggest that higher neighborhood income is associated with a higher likelihood of engaging in any drinking. So, so the type of alcohol use outcome we use matters. And then just a few other points. There have been some studies to suggest that the neighborhood matters more for certain people. So a study by Kerker-Jaffe and colleagues, they found that the impact of neighborhood on alcohol use, but it was particularly strong for African Americans. And some other work has also shown that females might be a little bit more vulnerable compared to males in terms of neighborhood effects. Okay, others, sorry. Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah, so in this map that I created, so there was a question about what the colors mean in this map. So the darker colors indicate higher levels of household income, and lighter would mean lower levels of household income, median household income in the neighborhood.
What are the red dots?
Oh yeah, those are the locations of individuals or from a Seattle-based study, so actual locations of addresses.
Both cases of addresses that are problems?
No, of actual people.
Oh.
Yeah. Okay, so in addition to neighborhood socioeconomic status or neighborhood SES conditions, other specific neighborhood social factors have been examined. So for example, variables like the perceived social disorganization, and there have been a number of studies suggest that perceptions of neighborhood social disorganization are associated with alcohol use and disordered use. But then there are other studies that have focused on like neighborhood level injunctive norms and individual alcohol use. And I want to touch on this one study in particular. This was conducted by Ahern et al. So here they were looking at neighborhoods in New York, and they were 59 community districts, and that's shown in the map. So what they did is they had 4,000 participants who were distributed across these 59 community districts. Each participant was asked to report on their own acceptability of hazardous or heavy drinking, as well as drunkenness. So then to create a true neighborhood contextual measure, they took all of those individual level responses and aggregating them up to the neighborhood. So for example, if 50 people lived in neighborhood X, we would average those responses of the 50 individuals to come up with this neighborhood contextual measure of norms against heavy drinking, norms for drunkenness, et cetera. And so what this study found indeed was that neighborhood level norms against heavy drinking, so weaker norms against heavy drinking was associated with a greater likelihood of binge drinking. Okay, so now let's move to think about more of the physical aspects of the neighborhood. And in regards to alcohol use, we typically consider the role of the availability of alcohol outlets and the density of alcohol outlets in the neighborhood. And there are two broad categories of outlets. One are on-premise alcohol outlets. So these are the places where you purchase alcohol and then you have to consume it on site. So places like bars, restaurants where you can, where they're licensed to sell alcohol. And then there are off-premise outlets. So these are places where you purchase alcohol, but you have to consume it off-site. So places like liquor stores or convenience stores that sell alcohol, et cetera. So we think about some of the pathways through which outlet density and availability could affect use. Obviously, one is just the increasing ease of access to alcohol. So if there's more alcohol outlets within your community or within your neighborhood, it's going to be easier to obtain. But then we also have to consider that alcohol outlets aren't distributed randomly across the population, and that's the the distribution of alcohol outlets is also somewhat socially patterned as well. They tend to concentrate in lower income areas in other parts of the United States. So this can mean that alcohol outlet could serve outlet density could be a cue or a signal for neighborhood disorder, or it could be also a cue or a signal for more acceptability of norm or more acceptable norms around heavy alcohol use as well, which could then influence alcohol use. So there is some increasing evidence for the role of alcohol outlet density on alcohol consumption and other related outcomes. So there have been a number of ecological level studies showing these associations between outlet density and the rates of alcohol consumption and alcohol-related problems. And then there's the results from multi-level studies, so where we have individual data on the alcohol outcomes. It's been a little bit more mixed, but still we're seeing some studies showing associations there between alcohol outlet density and alcohol use and related problems. And this could include on-premise outlets or off-premise outlets. It's still not completely clear which type may play a more important role or not. Some other alcohol-related outcomes have been studied as well in relation to alcohol outlet density, things like drinking and driving, alcohol-related violence and crime, and consistently these have shown to be associated. Okay, so we've been learning a lot about the role of neighborhood characteristics and its role in alcohol use and misuse, but there are still challenges that remain in regards to trying to infer causation. So one of these challenges is with confounding, right? So, all observational studies, we worry a lot about confounding. So associations that we see, maybe they're really explained by some third variable or a set of variables. So we get a little bit more concerned with this type of research because we have confounding that can occur on multiple levels. We have to worry about confounding due to individual level factors as well as confounding due to neighborhood level factors. And then in particular, thinking about some of these individual level factors, some that often go unmeasured include genetic influences. So one of my colleagues, Glenn Duncan, he and some other behavioral geneticists found that there was actually a lot of variance explained in where you lived that was due to genetic influences. So if those same genetic influences are also associated with alcohol use, there could be a problem with genetic confounding. And then somewhat related to this issue of confounding is that it might be kind of tough to get true comparability in residents of different neighborhood types, right? Again, people don't end up in neighborhoods just by random chance. There are really strong social forces, strong structural factors that potentially restrict the types of neighborhood that people can live in. So for example, someone living in poverty, it's pretty unlikely that they're going to end up buying a place or renting a place in a really high income neighborhood like Madison Park or Littlehurst or something. And similarly, someone who's very wealthy probably isn't going to want to live or end up living in a very, very economically distressed neighborhood. So one of the challenges with this is that, there might be a limited overlap in the distribution of these important characteristics like individual SES when we look at kind of low poverty neighborhoods versus high poverty neighborhoods. I mean, we can still run these models. We can still, adjust for individual SES, but just the interpretation is a little bit more tricky and inferring causation is a little tough. But there have been some methods to help address this, like propensity score-based methods and inverse probability weighting, et cetera, that try to help kind of explore this potential lack of overlap and ways to control for that. And I could get into it a lot more, but I won't. But then there are other methods that I've been a little bit more intrigued by, including the use of a twin design. So, we have monozygotic twins like the Bryan twins, who are famous doubles champions and who I share an alma mater with. And they could serve as a good proxy counterfactual for one another, right? So monozygotic twins, they share the same genetic profile, and they also share the same childhood family environment. So if two twins were within a pair were discordant for their neighborhood, so like they had different levels of neighborhood deprivation, for example, then we could then we could look at whether this within twin pair difference was associated with alcohol use or misuse. And this would give us an estimate of the association that's free from genetic confounding or confounding due to some shared environment or environmental characteristics too. We could also include dizygotic twins into the mix too, like the former first daughters, the Bush twins. They don't have quite the same rigor in terms of adjustment for genetic confounding, but for reasons that are a little complicated, it does help us understand potentially the level of genetic confounding that could occur, and they can also help us in other ways, which I'll get to in a few minutes. Okay, with that in mind, one of the things that I wanted to do or examine was then look at whether there are these within twin pair differences in neighborhood deprivation, as well as alcohol outlet density, and whether this could be associated with hazardous drinking. So to run this study, and this was a secondary data analysis project that I led, and so I used data from the Washington State Twin Registry, and this has been ongoing since 1999. Just a quick story about the Twin Registry and how it started. So Deidre Buchwald was the founding director of this Twin Registry, and she went in to get her driver's license in the late 90s. And she noticed that there was this question about whether or not she was a twin. So it turns out that the DOL, they create driver's license IDs based on last name and date of birth, right? So in order to avoid duplication of IDs, they ask whether someone is a twin or not. So anyway, this got Dr. Buchwald thinking and how cool it would be to then create a twin registry for research on health. So she approached the DOL and state officials, and the rest is history, and we have this Washington State Twin Registry. So as part of this registry, twins are asked to complete a pretty lengthy survey on health indicators. And we used survey data for this study that was collected from 2008 to 2012. And we started in 2008 because that's when this twin registry received some funding to integrate geospatial measures into the registry. So for this study, all twins were reared together to ensure that they had the same family environment, childhood environment, and both twins had to be living in the state of Washington. So ultimately, we had over 2,000 same-sex twin pairs in this sample, so over 4,000 individuals. So for this study, neighborhoods were defined as census tracts, and almost 1,200 census tracts were represented across the state of Washington in the Twin Registry in this analysis. And we used the SING index to describe tract-level socioeconomic deprivation. And so this was derived from 17 different tract-level variables, like the percent living in poverty, the median household income, median education. And so this map shows the values of the SING index just within King County or the King County area. So then we also created measures of alcohol outlet density. So first we had to obtain the spatial coordinates of these outlets, and that was provided to us from the Washington State Liquor and Cannabis Board. And then we created some measures for the census tract density of any type of outlet per square kilometer. And so, for a sensitivity analysis, we also looked at other different spatial measures. So we looked at on and off premise outlet density separately. And then we also looked at the density of outlets within a 1 kilometer road network buffer. So essentially we're looking at alcohol outlet density that's tailored to the individual rather than just look at the overall census tract. And then to assess hazardous drinking, we used a common 3-item measure called the audit C that asks about how frequently one engages in any drinking, how much they typically drink when they drink, and then how often they engage in binge drinking. And we created a total score based on these 3 items. Okay, this table, which might be a little bit hard to see, shows the results from the primary models. So these models adjusted also for household income and education, because these are things that could differ within twins within the pair. And then we also accounted for clustering or correlation of observations within the twins as well as within census tracts too. So consistent with some of the earlier findings, we see that neighborhood disadvantage or within pair differences in neighborhood deprivation are associated with higher levels of hazardous drinking. And this is before adjusting for alcohol outlet density and after adjusting for alcohol outlet density. But when we look at the effects of or the associations with alcohol outlet density and hazardous drinking, we're actually not seeing any evidence consistent with what we found earlier. So alcohol outlet density wasn't associated with any hazardous drinking. Okay. So twin studies can help us account for genetic confounding and help us improve causal inference to some degree. But there are also some other really interesting things that we can do with twin designs. One of the most important things that has been ongoing for a long period of time is that we can think about how the variance in an outcome, so here hazardous drinking, how much of that variance can be explained by different components. So first we can think about how much variance is explained by heritability or genetics, and this is often indicated by the letter A. We can think about how much variance is explained by shared environment. So, those things that I talked about earlier in the childhood environment, things like, parental substitutes or the parental style or whatever. And then we can also think about the variance explained by unique environmental factors. So things that make the twins different, or environmental factors that the twins do not share. And then we can extend these models even further to really look at whether the level of expression or the level of variance explained by these components differs by specific environmental characteristics. So, I was particularly interested to learn whether kind of there's the level of variance explained by genetics, whether that might differ across levels of neighborhood deprivation, which actually is consistent with some theories to suggest that genetic expression is stronger in areas with greater or more, with less informal social control. Okay, so just to give you a sense of some of these variance components and how they break down. So first we looked at the variance explained by these different components in neighborhood deprivation. So somewhat consistent with what my colleague found earlier, there was a not so trivial amount of variance explained by genetic heritability. So about 30% of variance in neighborhood deprivation was explained by genetic factors. Okay, now we're looking at the variance explained in hazardous drinking, and we're seeing about 38% of the variance is explained by heritability or genetic factors. That's actually fairly consistent with estimates that have been found in other twin studies and other samples. Okay, now this figure is essentially what you saw before, but now it's looking at those variance components across levels of neighborhood deprivation. Okay, so if we kind of track our eyes to that pink area, that's the level of variance explained by heritability. It kind of looks that as neighborhood deprivation goes up, the level of genetic expression goes down. But it turns out that that actually wasn't statistically significant, and actually results seem to suggest that the variance explained by each of these components remains relatively stable across levels of neighborhood deprivation. So a little bit anticlimactic, but that's what we saw. Okay, and I've been involved with a number of other studies looking at neighborhood contexts and looking at some slightly different questions. So in most studies, investigators are really focused on, or they end up just focusing on a single neighborhood characteristic at a time, sometimes maybe two, just like what I did, for those twin studies. But the reality is there, like I mentioned a little bit earlier, there could be a number of different neighborhood features or factors that could be involved and that could work together to influence alcohol use and misuse. So to actually look at that and try to understand using a traditional regression-based framework isn't really tenable. So some alternative methods could really help us out here. And so one of those methods that I've learned a little bit more about and started applying are these finite mixture models or latent profile, latent class analyses. So what these analyses are trying to do, and they've been typically used in social and behavioral sciences or behavioral sciences to really identify certain subtypes of individuals, so where they can see if there are certain distinct populations based on certain characteristics of the individuals. These are often called person-centered methods. So it occurred to me that maybe we could use these methods to also find certain types of neighborhoods according to different neighborhood characteristics. So for example, like maybe there'd be neighborhoods that are more disorganized, that tend to be more disorganized and also have greater alcohol greater alcohol outlet density or something, just to get a better sense of how neighborhoods tend to work together, form, and yield greater alcohol use problems. So for this, I used data from the Seattle Social Development Project, and there have been a number of PIs for this project over the years. This is a theory-driven longitudinal study on the etiology of prosocial and antisocial behaviors. And this study has followed over 800 participants from 5th grade all the way up to age 39. And that last age 39 wave was just in 2014. And Rick Kosterman, the current PI or the latest iteration of this study, and tried to bring in more neighborhood environmental variables to really look at the impact of those on substance use as well as physical and mental health. So despite the longitudinal nature of that design, for this particular analysis, I only used one survey wave, and that was at age 33. And a lot of that was just because of the complexity of the research or the statistical method that I was using. So this is a map showing the block groups where all of these participants lived at the time when they were age 33, and we had about 300 block groups in the sample at that time, and 500 participants who were living in King County. Okay, so for these models, we need to say what specific neighborhood variables are going to inform the types of neighborhood classes or the types of neighborhoods that we're going to get. So we used 5 neighborhood indicators, 2 census variables, so the percent living in poverty, the percent who are white race. We also used this indicator of neighborhood disorganization that was measured at the individual level. And then we had measures of alcohol outlet availability. So we looked at on-premise versus off-premise separately. Let me just quickly mention that for the alcohol outlet measures, most of the neighborhoods only had or didn't have any sort of alcohol outlets within them. So we just categorized them as yes, they had one or more or not. Okay, so we ran our models and we found that there were 5 distinct classes of neighborhoods or 5 distinct types of neighborhoods. So this is a heat map. So the places in red indicate higher values. The blue areas indicate lower values. So on the y-axis are the specific neighborhood variables, and the x-axis are the distinct neighborhood subtypes. So this first neighborhood subtype that we found, we thought it was really characterized by higher levels of poverty, mixed race, higher levels of perceived disorder, and at least compared to that 5th class, a lower likelihood of having an alcohol outlet in the neighborhood. The next 2 classes were characterized more by lower levels of poverty, lower levels of disorder, but again, relatively low likelihood of not having an alcohol outlet. Let me skip to this 5th class. We're here. This is a neighborhood that's really characterized by the presence of having an alcohol outlet within it. It also tended to have lower levels of poverty, higher percentage of those who were white race, and low levels of perceived disorder. So when we look at alcohol use outcomes across these 5 different neighborhood subtypes, what we see is those who lived in the more disorganized, more disadvantaged neighborhoods, they tended to report higher levels of typical drinking. So the numbers are showing the typical drinks per week. So statistically significant higher number of drinks per week compared to those in the other types of neighborhoods. What we don't see is increased levels of typical drinking in those in the neighborhoods characterized by alcohol outlet availability. And we see a similar pattern in regards to frequency of binge drinking. So higher levels of binge drinking in these disorganized, high poverty neighborhoods, but again, fairly low levels in the other types of neighborhoods, including those characterized by alcohol availability. Okay, so taken together, continue to see a role of socioeconomic disadvantage, social disorganization in alcohol use, and particularly heavier forms of alcohol use. So most of the stuff that I've talked about so far has really been focused on adults, and I haven't really mentioned any sort of developmental perspective in terms of thinking about when neighborhoods might matter more, et cetera. But some of my colleagues have, and so I'll just touch on some of that work really quickly. So they did take better advantage of the longitudinal design of the Seattle Social Development Project. So this study has had measures of neighborhood factors over time, as well as substance use, and particularly substance use disorders starting at age 21. So one of my colleagues, a former graduate student, Christopher Cambron, he was really interested in the developmental period of early adulthood. So we all know that heavy alcohol use tends to peak at age 21, but then decline as they get older. So people start to age out of heavier alcohol use. So he was really interested to see what the role of neighborhood disorganization could be during this important developmental period, and to see whether this association remains stable over time. He was also interested to know whether this association could be mediated by psychological distress, which we measured or defined as just the presence of having a major depressive disorder or anxiety disorder. So what he found was indeed across this developmental period, neighborhood disorganization, it didn't matter. Higher levels of perceived disorganization were associated with higher count of alcohol use disorder symptoms. And then he also did find that this association was mediated in some part by psychological distress. And then another cool study that was conducted by, or led by my colleague Olivia Lee, who's now over at USC. She took a more life course perspective and was looking at neighborhood stability, here defined as an index, like using variables such as the length of time living in the neighborhood, the percentage of homes that are owner versus renter occupied, et cetera. And this is often considered an indicator of social control in the neighborhood. So she looked at neighborhood stability all the way back at age 10. And then she wanted to see whether this was associated with alcohol use disorder symptoms, as well as cannabis use disorder symptoms, all the way over to age 39. So interesting, she did find that kind of increased neighborhood stability, so neighborhoods that ostensibly could have higher levels of social control, that was associated with lower likelihood or lower levels of alcohol use disorder symptoms. So in one standard deviation increase in neighborhood stability was associated with a 17% decrease in the number of alcohol use disorder symptoms at age 39. And she also found something similar with cannabis use disorder symptoms, although that didn't quite reach that magical p-value of 0.05, but still at least a similar effect size that we're seeing. So pretty impressive that we're seeing this role of childhood neighborhood environment, that it could have potentially lingering effects all the way into adulthood. And this does bring to mind the Moving to Opportunity study. This was a randomized trial that randomized low-income families to either to get extra assistance and vouchers to move out of high poverty neighborhoods into low poverty neighborhoods, or they were randomized to some control group where they didn't receive this extra assistance. And so some pretty fascinating results came out of that trial, suggesting that there were significant socioeconomic, social benefits to the Moving to Opportunity intervention for those who were able to move out of those high poverty neighborhoods. Okay, so quick summary about some of the work that I've done. So all these findings similarly have been really relatively consistent with prior findings on neighborhood disadvantage and neighborhood disorganization, suggestive of the role of disadvantage and disorganization on alcohol use and misuse. And we're also seeing that this is consistent for adults and early adults, and that even refining these associations, they linger from childhood into later adulthood. But continued research into the timing of these associations and actually for whom these neighborhoods matter could be informative as we start to think about neighborhood level interventions. And let me take a minute to unpack the alcohol outlet density findings as well. So in our studies, we didn't find a role of alcohol outlet density. So before we start putting an alcohol outlet in every block, I think we need to consider a few things. One, a lot of studies have found that other alcohol use outcomes have been consistently associated with alcohol outlet density. So like the drinking and driving, the violence, et cetera. So maybe some of these other alcohol related outcomes are more sensitive to the alcohol outlet environment. But also we really need to consider the state context at the time. So when these data were collected that I used, they were all collected in 2012 or earlier. So this is before the passage of I-1183, which privatized the sales of liquor. So before then, liquor sales were regulated by the state. So this might have, one, decreased the variability in the distribution of alcohol outlets. And then two, it might have reduced the possibility that alcohol outlets would be concentrated in areas that might cater to certain niche markets that are more vulnerable to heavy alcohol use. Okay, starting to run out of time, but let's talk a little bit about some of the future directions with this research on geospatial context. Okay, so I've talked a lot about residential neighborhood context, but reality is a lot of us spend a lot of time outside of our own neighborhoods and thus get a lot of exposure to different types of environments. So the places where we go include where we work, where we play, where we worship, where we socialize, where we go to school, et cetera. And so this is a map that I created. And Google is tracking us all the time, and I allowed it to explicitly track where I go. So I turned on Google Timeline. And this is just a map showing kind of my travel paths across a certain day. So, I spent some time at home in Ravenna, but then, did ran some errands at Home Depot. I think I stopped in at work for a little while. And don't judge me, I went up to an alcohol outlet later in the day to meet up with some family and friends. So some other researchers have also started to branch out from the residential neighborhood environments and started to think about the fuller extent of our spatial or geospatial exposures and our activity spaces. For example, Amanda Burns and some of her colleagues track the movements of adolescents in the Bay Area using GPS. And they track these adolescents over the course of a few weeks. And during that time, they also used EMA methods to have them complete multiple assessments per day on alcohol and other substance use. So this map in blue is the travel path of one specific participant. The red and the white dots are alcohol outlets. The green regions, they indicate the level of disorganization, right? So using these methods and integrating these data, they found that alcohol users and marijuana users, they tended to spend more time in disadvantaged neighborhoods, spent more time near alcohol outlets. One of the things they didn't do is actually try to link the alcohol and substance use at the event level with the spatial characteristics. But other people have been trying to do that. So some studies have found that greater exposure in like the 24 hours prior to use. So there's greater exposure to alcohol or to tobacco outlets that was associated with tobacco craving and use. Okay, oops. So I thought it might be interesting too to extend these methods to think about marijuana use. So we all know the legal landscape, the social landscape of marijuana use has been changing drastically. And now the physical landscape of marijuana use has been changing with the openings of marijuana retail outlets over the city, as you can see on this map. And I just show this one particular marijuana retail outlet that I drive by on Lake City Way every so often. I remember the first time that I saw it, I thought it was like some design store or something. And then I figured out what that leaf was. We all know, or we know too, that marijuana use is on the rise, and particularly in adults. So this is data from the National Survey on Drug Use and Health. And we also know that more problematic forms of marijuana use is on the rise, including daily use.
Do you think that could be reporting? People are more likely to report when it's legal than it's not legal?
It's possible. It's hard to know for sure, but I think we're still trying to figure out the potential role of the policy on actual use. And I still think it's going to be a few years before we actually know more about that. So let me briefly tell you about this pilot study that I'm conducting with support from the department. So using these methods, that have been described earlier, integrating GPS and EMA, we could use these to start linking real-time geospatial contexts and other risk factors for marijuana use and craving. So right now we're conducting this pilot study and we're finalizing and testing EMA surveys, and we're going to start enrolling subjects in the next month who are going to be young adult marijuana users who are living in the Seattle area. And so they're good for 2 weeks, they're going to be wearing this GPS device, and then they're going to be doing these EMA methods where we're going to be asking about their marijuana use, craving, and mood, et cetera. And so then we're going to try to create these geospatial measures of retail time spent in neighborhoods or areas close to retail outlets, time spent in disadvantaged areas, to see how they might be related to their actual event level marijuana use. So we're pretty excited about some of these directions. One, it could continue to form our understanding of the role of marijuana retail outlets on use. Also, it could potentially be useful in clinical settings, as clinicians could start using these data about where people go and how certain neighborhood or certain geospatial factors might be related to their risk of use. And then also this might inform some more mobile health interventions that can target people at high risk locations and high risk moments. Okay. I'm just going to skip over this quickly. As evidence continues to mount for the role of neighborhoods, I think more concerted efforts to develop and test interventions at the neighborhood level could be warranted. Obviously, there's going to be easier said than done because of the challenges of scaling up an intervention to such a more of a macro level. But there have been a few examples that are starting to occur in the literature. For example, there have been some studies that have focused on neighborhood interventions that really try to improve the social capital and the social integration within neighborhoods. So things like the City Repair Project and the Well London Project in England. And then there have been a few other interventions that have been more focused explicitly on alcohol use, really trying to change the norms in the neighborhoods trying to change the policies around underage drinking, et cetera. Okay, let me just close with this. So as we think about our strategies, as we think about improving neighborhoods, I think we have to have an eye towards minimizing displacement. So we all know that gentrification is occurring widely across our Seattle neighborhoods. So this is just a map showing how poverty in King County is starting to concentrate outside of the city as low-income families are being pushed out. So I think this is an important area of future study, understanding the impact of gentrification. For those who are displaced, they might experience what Mindy Fololove over in Columbia, a psychiatrist there, calls root shock. So here, for these families who are being displaced, their social networks are being disrupted, their social relationships, et cetera. Their communities are are changing pretty rapidly. So this could have pretty long-term negative consequences. Okay, so with that, let me end and let me quickly acknowledge a few people on the support that I've had for this research. So on the twin study, I had funding from the University of Washington Royalty Research Project, and also the NIA provided funding for the infrastructure for the twin study. I'm particularly grateful to Glenn Duncan, who's the current PI or the current director of the Twin Registry. Very grateful to Rick Kosterman, who's the current PI or one of the PIs of the Seattle Social Development Project and funding from NIDA. For this GPS EMA study that I'm piloting, really grateful to the department here for the funding, as well as the study team that I get to work with. And then finally, let me just say, context matters for health, I believe. I think context matters for our work. So I just want to say how grateful I am for the work context that I have at the Center for the Study of Health and Risk Behaviors. I get to work with a really great group of people who do really innovative things, who are very bright, who are very productive, and are very friendly. So I think that has benefited my work greatly. So thank you so much. Thanks for your time. I think we're out of time, but I'm willing to stick around and answer any questions that anyone may have.
Did you ever try to, since you didn't find a finding due to the density of the alcohol outlets, did you ever look at the volume of those outlets too and look for a correlation that way?
Sorry, volume of...
The volume, how much they sell?
Oh yeah, that's a really interesting question. I haven't done that, but I would imagine that would be a pretty impactful...
Not every bar is the same. Some bars have more expensive drinks.
Absolutely. Yeah, so yeah, I think there is definitely room to do more fine-grained research on the specific types of outlets. Here's one thing to have exactly what you're saying. There's on-premise outlets, and then there's different types of on-premise outlets, and there's bars and there's restaurants. So perhaps like doing a finer-grained investigation of how many things could be really worthwhile. Yep. Yeah.
Nice. Isaac, thanks for introducing us to this field. Is there anyone who's getting ahead of the gentrification process and health effects?
Right. So a question about gentrification and research in this field. Not that I'm aware of. I personally haven't seen any literature on this yet, or kind of empirical literature on this yet. But a lot of people are thinking about it, and it makes sense that this gentrification could be really disruptive, and particularly for those who are displaced. But I also think it could be very disruptive for neighborhoods themselves that are gentrifying, as we think about, particularly if people being displaced are those who've been living there for a long time. That could really disrupt the social fabric of these neighborhoods and really disrupt the community bonds that are there. I did happen to review a paper recently, and so I think that might come out pretty soon, and I'll keep you posted when it does. Yep.
So years ago, after a tragic killing in the LA area, there's a good piece in the Seattle Times about how Seattle is very different from East Coast cities. There's really an overlap of socioeconomic status within neighborhoods. I'm a long-time resident of the Central District in Capitol Hill. You can see this.
Right.
There are houses worth millions of dollars right next to houses that will probably be terrible.
That's right.
Can you use that to your advantage to really study the effects? Because these folks are living in the same neighborhood technically, but clearly have very different lifestyles and often factors. Can you use that?
Yeah, I think you could. These are interesting neighborhoods, right, that are definitely more mixed. And so yeah, there's places in the Central District, there's places like Columbia City too that are also pretty mixed racially and socioeconomically. There have been some studies that have tried to look at neighborhood level versus individual interactions. And some studies actually have found that kind of the impact of neighborhood disadvantage is stronger for those who are of lower income. So there's kind of this magnification of SES, both the individual and the area level, that could further amplify the risk for problems. But I think it's particularly interesting just thinking about more about the heterogeneity itself, or trying to model the heterogeneity of itself in terms of the composition. I don't know if a lot of people have done that, but I think that's a really intriguing area of research.
So,
yeah.
I think of the various things that you talked about that characterize a neighborhood, like the disadvantage and the disorganization and the alcohol outlets, I imagine those things often will go hand in hand.
Mm-hmm.
But what I find interesting is that you clearly find from neighborhood disorganization itself, you clearly find often a strong effect of that, which is a piece of that you could really intervene with and do something about the sense of community,
right?
The sense of disorganization, against crime, rundown housing, and those kinds of things. You can attack that easier. So I'm just intrigued that the kind of a shout out to the community organizers.
Right.
Like that's really something that you can a button you can push there to make some difference. Is that ring true with you?
Right. Yeah, I think so. I think there are things that we could do on like just grassroots community within the community to really do that. I mean, I think you're right, but it's going to involve mobilizing residents across different families or different types of people in the neighborhood, right? Not just like the high SES people in the neighborhood, but really getting it to be a community-wide effort. Grassroots effort is going to be really important. I do think also that kind of infrastructure that the city could provide toward these neighborhoods is also going to be pretty key too, just in terms of providing those material resources to keep whatever intervention or keep whatever activities sustained kind of through the long term. But yeah, I agree. I think kind of thinking about some ways to improve neighborhoods can be really interesting. Yep.
Have you looked at getting some of the work you're doing towards opiates?
Yeah, that's a great question. I myself have not been thinking so much about kind of the contextual effects of opiates, but I know colleagues in the department who are. I know Mark Sullivan has become very interested in kind of the geospatial context and looking at that. But I mean, I think a lot of the same theoretical underpinnings could apply to opiate use. I think, we talk a lot about social isolation and kind of disruption of social capital, particularly in regards to those who struggle with opioids and opiate addiction. And so I think we can imagine then that kind of neighborhoods or areas kind of where there is greater sense of social disconnection, social isolation could increase risk for opioid addiction for sure. Oh, yep.
Is there a place, or do you know of any context in which spatial information, like neighborhood characteristics, is being used to tailor clinical interventions? That's
a great question. I am not so sure about how neighborhood information is tailoring clinical interventions, but I have seen data to suggest that neighborhoods matter in terms of the clinical course for people in substance use addiction or in substance use treatment. We have seen that people who are in substance use treatment who live in more disadvantaged neighborhoods, they are less likely to get into treatment, and then they are less likely to have to kind of continue or complete treatment as well. So definitely think there's a role for clinicians to start thinking about their neighborhood context. So I don't know if that is more just information that the clinicians can use to further try to increase or further remove barriers to treatment. But I do think it could suggest something about increasing resources in certain types of neighborhoods for sure, and or reducing neighborhood level barriers to treatment. Okay, thank you.